Our final lecture of the course is on the emergence of world Christianity. This is a huge topic, so think of it as the first word on the subject, not the last. And I basically want to talk a little bit about the emergence of world Christianity in very general terms, and then I want to provide just one case study of what it looked like on the ground, so to speak. To begin with, when I was a senior in high school, I read a short story by Washington Irving called Rip Van Winkle. And the basic storyline is that there's this guy living in pre-revolutionary America, and he falls asleep in the mountains for several decades. And when he wakes up, everything's different. His wife is dead, his children are grown, the pictures of King George are replaced by pictures of George Washington. And in a relatively short period of time, Rip Van Winkle's world underwent enormous changes. And in much the same way, the Christian world has undergone enormous changes in the past decades. More specifically, there's been a major geographical redistribution of Christianity from the West, Europe and North America, to what is often called the Global South, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So let me illustrate what I mean. Here are a few things to consider about the current landscape of Christianity. And I'm taking all of these statements from a book by Mark Noll called The New Shape of World Christianity. Last Sunday, there were more Roman Catholics at church in the Philippines than in any other single country in Europe, including Italy. Last Sunday, there were more Presbyterians at church in Ghana than in Scotland, and there were more Presbyterians at church in Southern Africa than in the United States. Last Sunday, there were more people at the Assemblies of God churches in Brazil than the Assemblies of God churches in the United States. Last Sunday, more people attended church at the Yodo Full Gospel Church in Seoul, Korea, than in Canada's 10 largest churches combined. Finally, last Sunday, more Anglicans went to church in Kenya than in Great Britain, Canada, and the United States combined. What I'm getting at with all of these statements is that the critical mass of Christianity is no longer in Europe and North America, the places that most of this history course has been centered on. Most of the world's Christians now live in places like Latin America and Africa. So for example, let's take a look at this chart. Just over 100 years ago, in 1900, most of the Christians in the world lived in Europe and North America. 68% in Europe, 14% in North America. And if you look at that now, it's only 27% in Europe and 13% in the United States. But look at those last three categories. In 1900, 11% of all the Christians in the world were in Latin America. Now that's 24%. And Africa, a mere 2% of the world's Christians. And today, 20% in Asia and the Pacific, only 5% of the world's Christians, and today it's 16%. If you want to look at that visually in terms of a pie graph, this shows you the current distribution of where Christians are in the world. And the thing that's so remarkable is that all of this has happened in just over 100 years. So this is a huge shift in the story of Christianity. If you've made it to the end of the Gonzalez book, then you might have noticed how he concludes that 2-volume history of the Christian church. Here's what Gonzalez says. The story is not finished. There is still much to do, much to learn, and much to write. Among the readers of The Story of Christianity, will there be someone who will take up this task? I hope and pray to the God of all history that it may be so. And the point that Gonzalez is getting at is that the story has changed again in the last 100 years. And that's a story that historians are kind of scrambling to pick up on to try to figure out what all just happened in the last 100 years to have this tremendously huge shift in the critical mass of Christianity. And so for this final lecture, I want to talk about that shift a little bit and see if we can start to point to some of the causes of that. The rise of the Christian church in Africa is really interesting, but it's also really messy and complicated and controversial. And one of the major reasons that it's so messy and complicated and controversial is that it's associated with European imperialism and colonization. So we need to say a few things about colonial powers and imperialism. Let's just consider the British Empire. The British Empire was massive, largest empire in history. It spanned almost half a millennium and eventually included every continent. And at its zenith, it boasted approximately 1/4 of both the Earth's population and habitable surface. Well, that kind of feat was really unimaginable when the British Empire first began in the 16th and 17th century. Initially, the British were just interested in things like commercial opportunities that would come from commodities like sugar and tobacco. But by the end of the 18th century, Britain dominated much of the Atlantic, despite the fact that they couldn't check the rebellion of the American colonies. On the other side of the globe, the East India Company controlled the imports of cotton, silk, and tea, and also they controlled substantial portions of India until the Sepoy Rebellion prompted the British government to dissolve the company and assume responsibility for the entire subcontinent in 1857. And it wasn't just the British who were playing the imperial game. Additional nations such as France, Portugal, Germany, Italy, Belgium, and the United States were all interested in overseas expansion. They all wanted a piece of the pie, so to speak. Prior to 1880, Africa contained a limited number of European settlements. By the dawn of the First World War, 6 different European powers had basically succeeded in partitioning the entire continent, leaving only Liberia and Ethiopia untouched. So there was this scramble for Africa, and you can see a map similar to this one in the Gonzalez text on page 433. So what does all of that business about colonization and empire building have to do with the story of the church? Well, missionaries suddenly had access to the ends of the earth, so to speak. And this is where the story of Christianity gets really dicey. Some historians believe that missionary work was simply the product of Western imperial pursuits. In other words, some historians will say that missionaries were simply a means or a strategy for governing and controlling other people. On the other hand, there's a growing number of scholars now who acknowledge that although missions was inextricably coupled with the empire, there were nevertheless significant tensions between the two, and that the former were not necessarily a servant of the latter. In other words, you have historians now who maintain that missionaries were not motivated by political reasons, but rather by theological or scriptural reasons. So whatever you think about all of that and that debate, Africa underwent this rapid process of colonization, and with that colonization came the arrival of missionaries. A lot of people are surprised that Christianity would grow so fast given these political circumstances. But what ultimately happened is that thousands of African indigenous churches, or AICs, sprang up alongside the Western-led missionary congregations, or they split off from the missionary congregations. But they didn't quite look the same as the church back in Europe or North America. In general, the African cultures presumed that salvation was not just about spiritual dimensions of human life, but rather that salvation included things like bodily health, family relations, social harmony, financial prosperity, and general human wellness. And a lot of times, Western missionaries didn't appreciate this cultural aspect. And that's a major reason why you had the emergence of these AICs, because they were looking for a more holistic conception of salvation. Another common feature of these AIC churches involved the belief or the emphasis on malign spiritual forces, unholy forces associated with witchcraft and sorcery. A major function of African traditional religions from time immemorial has been to protect people against evil spirits. And if you begin with these two assumptions, that salvation means personal and family wellness, and that evil spiritual forces stand against the experience of this wellness, then things like healing and social restoration may be expected as the outcome when evil forces are removed. So that's kind of the beginning of African Christianity painted in the broadest possible brushstrokes. More or less, the Africans took the Christian message that they heard from the missionaries, but it was recast into a framework or into a mold that was more in line with their own culture. I now want to talk about the rise of Christianity in East Africa, or at least the rise of Protestant Christianity in East Africa. And a big part of that story centers on what's called the East African Revival. One reason I want to look at East Africa is that it's a particularly vibrant church. And secondly, the East African context provides some helpful examples of what we might call a successful handoff or a passing of the baton from missionaries to an indigenous-led church. So with that in mind, here's a little bit about East Africa. For centuries, the kingdom of Buganda was ruled by the Kabaka, or king, but it was subdivided into territories under the leadership of chiefs that had considerable power, the Bataka. And it was this delicate balance of power that was easily aggravated by loyalties to the various gods of the Buganda pantheon. So when Arab traders arrived in the middle of the 19th century, the Kabaka Mutesa saw in Islam a potential religious force that could unify his kingdom and provide stability. However, Islam soon became a political force of its own, and some converts began resisting the Kabaka in the name of their new religion, in the name of Islam. So when you have Christian missionaries like George Pilkington arriving in 1877, Christianity was considered a potential force to counteract the growing dominance of Islam. And then this situation is further exacerbated when the French White Fathers or Catholic missionaries show up in 1879, which presented yet an additional competitor for the loyalty of the Buganda people. Well, after several shifts in power, the scales finally tipped to the Protestants in 1892, primarily because they had the Maxim guns of Frederick Lugard and the Imperial British East Africa Company. By 1894, Uganda was declared a protectorate of Great Britain. So again, the whole setting, the whole situation for the rise of Christianity starts with this really complicated political system with lots of competition among three different religious groups, Muslims, Protestants, and Catholics, and it finally ends more or less because of military power. So it starts off with a really complicated political situation. Well, throughout all this political turmoil, there's missionary work going on, but there's not a lot of vitality. The church in Uganda was mostly nominal. People would usually convert because it was to their advantage to be associated with the dominating power. But there wasn't really much life or much sincerity to the church. And in some cases, converts would even change their mind and want to return to their traditional religion. So for example, in 1893, a baptized convert named Musa Gaibuganda indicated that he wished to be withdrawn from the church and return to his previous religion. And here's what he told the missionary. "This religion of yours is no good. I sin as much as I ever did. I want you to give out my name in church as one going back to heathenism." So again, the church isn't off to a very good start in Buganda, in East Africa. After a few decades and some missionary turnover, something different happened in East Africa. Namely, there was a revival. And the story of the East African revival begins with the founding of what's called the Rwanda Mission. There were a couple of Cambridge doctors who read a book called The Heart of Africa by the Duke of Mecklenburg. And it was full of stories and images from places like Rwanda and Burundi. And so these doctors head off to Uganda with the intent of entering these unreached areas with the gospel and modern medicine. In 1921, they start to set up hospitals in places like Kabale and Gahina, but always with their eyes on unreached areas. And by 1946, this mission had grown from 1 station with 5 workers to 8 stations with 49 missionaries. So it had pretty remarkable growth. But what's more remarkable is what happened within this mission. One of the missionary doctors that came to the Rwanda mission was this man named John Edward Church, usually just known as Joe Church. And what's significant about Joe Church is he brought with him this particular brand of spirituality that was especially helpful within the African context. And so that's what we need to look at for just a second, and then we'll get back to East Africa. In a previous lecture, we talked about the rise of evangelicalism. And we noted that one of the central tenets of evangelicalism was conversion, having a conversion experience. But for evangelicals, there was more than just conversion. They didn't all agree with each other about the particulars, but just about everybody thought that there should be significant holiness that emerges out of a converted life. So if you're familiar with John Wesley, he spends a lot of time talking about sanctification, talking about things like Christian perfection or entire sanctification. If you've read Jonathan Edwards, he talks a lot about the religious affections or about what a genuine Christian life looks like. So there's lots of discussion about what does it mean to be a holy Christian. And what started to happen in the 19th century is you had a lot of Christians who had been Christians their entire life, maybe were even members of the clergy, but they felt like there wasn't any real vitality. They felt like they had just been born into the Christian tradition, similar to what the Pietists had originally experienced. And so in 1875, in the village of Keswick in North England, the vicar of the local church there started having these summer gatherings or conventions for the promotion of practical holiness. So people would come like for a weekend and they would have messages about how can you become holy? How can you grow in your Christian life, so to speak? And it really takes off. It starts off with just a few hundred people, and over the span of a couple of decades, you start having thousands of people show up at these Keswick conventions. And these Keswick conventions basically developed this kind of 5-day pattern, where they would first on the day 1 talk about the severity of sin, then they would talk about how God has provision for sin, but then on the 3rd day they would talk about consecration. They would push that you would not be satisfied just with becoming a Christian, but that you would consecrate your life, that there would be a turning point where you would say, I'm not satisfied with just being converted. I want more. I want to be of more service to God. And then the fourth day would talk about what that would look like. What does a spirit-filled life, what does it look like? How do you live? But this would often lead to a question. How should a Christian, a holy Christian, look? In the past, if you remember, the first Christians, the holy Christians were martyrs. People like Polycarp, Justin Martyr, people like Perpetua. That's what holy Christians did. They were martyrs. But after Christianity became legalized, then the next question was, well, how can Christians be holy now? And the answer to that question was you could become a monk. Holy Christians can become monastics. They can live in the monastery. Now, that by the time we get to the 19th century, there's a new question again, or I guess it's the same question, but a different answer. What does the holy Christian life look like? And the answer coming out of the Keswick Convention was being a missionary. Holy Christians, people who are fully consecrated to God, can become missionaries. And so out of this Keswick milieu, so to speak, you start having a lot of missionaries. Here's a segment from a sermon given at a Keswick convention that was very typical. The speaker says, "There are men and women here who have given themselves to God. He wants you to dare a little more for Africa. There's no need for you in Britain except to be gentlemen and comfortable. You are needed in Africa." So in summary, Keswick called Christians to recommit themselves to their faith and then challenged them to demonstrate that commitment by becoming missionaries. And you didn't have to go to a Keswick convention to hear this message. You could hear it in the writings of people like J. Hudson Taylor, or you saw this message coming through in various periodicals of the time. So for example, here's a little cartoon that appears in a Christian periodical that's kind of coming out of this Keswick tradition. And you can see God's call to service, and you have this guy hiding among business, excuses, pleasure, personal ambitions, kind of like Saul. Here's another example of how Christians that had recently recommitted themselves to the faith were called to missionary service. So you can see in the cartoon, there's this quotation from Genesis 12, "Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from the Father's house into the land that I will show thee, and I will bless thee, and be thou a blessing." And if you notice, if you look on the map, these are all of the places that didn't have much of a Christian presence around the year 1900. And these are the places now that for the most part have a thriving Christian presence. Okay, let's get back to John Edward Church, or Joe Church. Church had been a Christian his whole life, but it had been kind of a nominal form of Christianity. And after he had an experience of divine healing, he had this Keswick-like experience where he decided to rededicate his life to serving Christ, and he becomes a missionary and a doctor, and he heads off to Uganda in 1927. And when he got there, things were not going well at all because there was a terrible famine and there was disease everywhere. And Church was totally overwhelmed. He wrote back to a British newspaper and he said, quote, "The plight of these miserable people is beyond description. The country is littered with corpses. One often finds women and children lying helpless in the road at night, perhaps to be eaten by the hyenas before death comes to them. This is a land of skeletons, living and dead." And if the disease and famine wasn't bad enough, Church and his fellow missionaries also feel like there is undeniable spiritual famine. There's a church there and it's present, but it seems superficial and nominal. It doesn't seem like there's any real sincerity or vibrancy to the faith there. So totally discouraged, Church takes this brief holiday and he goes to Kampala and he runs into someone named Simeon Sebambi. Simeon Sabambi and Joe Church decide that they're going to spend a couple of days together reading their Bibles and praying for the church in East Africa, praying that the church would have power and vitality and holiness. And after 2 days of this, they both feel refreshed and encouraged. Sabambi decides he's going to quit his government job and become an evangelist and start talking about holiness, kind of this Keswick variety that we talked about earlier. Over the next couple of years, Africans who were kind of nominally Christian started responding to Sabambi and Joe Church. For example, one of Church's co-workers at the hospital he worked at, an African named Yosia Kanuka, he was confronted by Sabambi about his sin and his lack of genuine Christian commitment. And they go back and forth about these matters for a while, and finally Yosia has this moment where he surrenders himself. He says, "I kept pondering over these things, and before I got back I was deeply convicted. My sins became like a burden on my back, and I yielded to Christ." And as there are more and more of these kinds of conversions or surrenders, these newly surrendered Christians decide to have a convention very similar to what was happening over in Keswick, these conventions for Christians calling them to be more committed. And in December of 1933, they host a conference over Christmas. And no one is really taking any interest until the last day, when someone named Blasio Kigozi speaks. And as the story goes, during the prayer, an African man rises from his seat and he begins to confess his sins. And then someone else does the same thing, and then someone else, and very quickly there's this wave of conviction that passes through this small conference. And Africans begin to confess their sins to each other for 2.5 hours. The same thing starts happening in other places as people like Church and Kanuka and Kigozi travel around with this message of surrender. And this marks the beginning of what's usually called the East African Revival. Revitalized Christians, primarily Africans, travel all around Lake Victoria, through Rwanda and into Uganda, Burundi, Kenya, what's now Tanzania, and the Sudan. And many of these conventions or conferences would draw crowds of thousands, sometimes as many as 15 or 20,000. And the Christians that were part of the revival called themselves the Bolokoli, or the saved ones. And one of the things that I hope you're picking up on here is that this revival is an indigenous-led movement. To be sure, there are Western missionaries like Joe Church that are involved. But the real leadership of this new revival movement is rooted in the East Africans themselves. They take this Western tradition and they make it their own. And one of the ways that you can appreciate this is that a lot of the Western missionaries didn't really like the revival. They didn't like everything that was associated with the revival. So for example, the revivalists would have these all-night hymn singing sessions. They would regularly and publicly confess their sins to one another. They would call that walking in the light. And the missionaries didn't really like those practices, but they also couldn't really do anything about it because this was a movement that they weren't in charge of anymore. They weren't leading it. So you have this message that comes from the West, but it's also ultimately received and then appropriated by the East Africans themselves. With just about all revivals, people ask, well, why do they happen? Why was there a Great Awakening? Why is there a second Great Awakening? And as you can imagine, people answer those questions in lots of different ways. There are political explanations, there are social explanations, and that's the case with the East African Revival. There are a lot of different explanations, and they're not necessarily incompatible with each other. But for now, let me try to offer at least 3 different kinds of explanations for the timing of this revival in East Africa, which led to so much growth in the church. First, contextually, remember this all happens just a couple of generations after the scramble for Africa, which brought with it a scramble for souls, and that resulted in widespread nominalism. And then think back to what the Keswick folks, people like Church, were proclaiming. They were saying that there could be a post-conversion experience where an individual can surrender themselves. In other words, that you can be a Christian from birth and have a significant moment where you appropriate or accept the faith for yourself. And in the case of the revival, this gave East Africans an opportunity to reestablish or newly establish their spiritual loyalties, apart from all of the colonial pressures that they had when Western missionaries first arrived. So I think there was something appealing about an opportunity to get to appropriate the faith. As one historian said, the emphases of the Keswick tradition provided the key for Africans to seize the initiative in transforming a superficial brand of imported Christianity into an authentic African faith. So that's one kind of explanation. Second, an argument can be made that the revival promoted upward social mobility. And here's why. Members of the revival quickly became associated with honesty and with doing the right thing. So this was an argument made several decades ago by a political scientist at Columbia. And the idea was that the revival had this emphasis on holiness. Holiness included doing the right thing, so it made you a more trustworthy person, and that provided you with social mobility. Third, there's a non-sectarian aspect going on with East African revival. The Keswick Convention and its message was inherently a non-sectarian and non-hierarchical kind of message. The Keswick movement didn't care what denomination you belonged to. It didn't care if you were rich or poor, or if you were a man or a woman. It didn't care if you were a Methodist, an Anglican, a Baptist, or a Presbyterian. Holiness, said Keswick, was available to everyone, and everyone could be part of the movement. As such, that Keswick theology provided East Africans with an opportunity to create their own leadership structures and methods without needing approval or involvement from a Western ecclesial system. The revivalists weren't interested in whether you were Anglican or Lutheran or Mennonite or Methodist. Anyone could be part of the Bolokoli, could be part of the revival tradition. So you can make an argument that this Western tradition was a good vehicle for taking ownership. As one missionary commented after the fact, quote, "The revival profoundly challenged the assumptions of European superiority in the church and opened the way for African responsibility and leadership." Well, that's a really quick introduction to the rise of world Christianity, African Christianity, and the East African revival. But it's important that we see at least one example of the indigenous appropriation of the faith. Because again, the critical mass of Christianity is now outside the Western world. And that's a shift that has most historians scrambling to see and understand how it all happened. Thank you so much for listening.